Person den Rechten.
La cantante de María 200 ans appelle 2% de la population.
Teil an der Nordseite sowie des
Außenbereichs de la population idéale
Moving forward.
Sustainable mobility is connected to mobility justice. And I want to talk about what I mean by mobility justice by thinking about disasters and what happens when mobility systems fail, because it's one of the ways in which we become most aware of the inequality of mobility. And when we think of sustainability, it's often described as having three pillars or three legs. One is ecological and the sort of environmental sustainability. The second is economic. Can we sort of economically sustain something? And the third has to do with social sustainability, which concerns democracy and equity and fairness. So when we talk about sustainability and sustainable mobility, we need to think about all of those, environmental, economic, and social justice, as part of what makes something sustainable. So I use the term mobility justice as a way to think about all of the things that go into making equitable and fair capacity for mobility. And on the one hand, it begins with self-determination of movement. And for me, because I've studied the history of slavery and emancipation, slavery is the extreme example of non-self-determination of mobility, where you are trapped by someone else. Think of being in chains or in prison. That's a situation where you have no self-determination of movement. Secondly is motility as the sort of potential for mobility. And that's a different kind of thing than just sort of physical capacities, but all sorts of cultural skills and know-how and forms of potential access, which you do not have to necessarily use, but to be able to decide when and how you will be mobile is the power that we call motility. Finally, I also refer to the idea of mobility capability, drawing on the capabilities approach, which is that we have not just a right to mobility, but we need to ensure people's capabilities for mobility. And those three things together, self-determination of movement, motility, and mobility capability, make what I call mobility justice. And in certain disasters, we see a complete failure of mobility justice. And I'm going to talk about two examples. One was Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans, and also to think more recently about Hurricane Sandy and its effects on the east coast of North America. And then the second example I'll turn to is the earthquake in Haiti in January of 2010. So learning from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, we saw a city that was completely flooded, and more recently in Hurricane Sandy, we saw lower Manhattan completely flooded and parts of the outer boroughs of Manhattan being hit by just so much water in a way that has been predicted, it's been expected, and yet nobody's really prepared for it when it happens. When a transportation system gets completely shut down, we can see that natural disasters, yes, they affect everybody, but they affect the poor and the kind of marginalized areas more than the center and the places of power and the people who have higher mobility potential. So in New Orleans, we saw the levees overflow, especially into the poorer neighborhoods, and we saw roadways knocked out, and that the people who were able to evacuate were those who had access to cars and could get out quickly, and the people who did not have cars, who maybe did not even have bus fare or a place to go to, they were the ones who were left behind. This relates to the idea of Elliott and Urey of what they call network capital. And network capital means all the things that go into the capacities to be mobile. And that includes money, documents, qualifications, access to networks, location-free information and contact points, the physical capacity for movement, but also the sort of communicational capacity to be able to use phones and other communication devices and to secure meeting places and to have access to vehicles, infrastructure, and time and other resources for coordination. Those are all the forms of network capital that are missing for the people who are left behind in a disaster like Hurricane Katrina. And so, as it was reported on at the time, for example, the New York Times wrote that the victims were largely Black and poor, those who toiled in the background of the tourist havens, living in tumble-down neighborhoods that were long known to be vulnerable to disaster if the levees failed. Without so much as a car or bus fare to escape ahead of time, they found themselves left behind by a failure to plan for their rescue should the dreaded day ever arrive. So there's been a lot of research within transportation studies on what some call transportation apartheid, or the sort of the question of the right to the city, who is able to be mobile and to come and go in a city and who cannot. Turning then to the January 2010 earthquake in Haiti, we have an even more extreme example of the kinds of inequalities that come to light in mobility capabilities after a disaster. I was working in Haiti with a NSF-funded research team we were working on issues of local participation in rebuilding water and sanitation systems. So I was there, the earthquake occurred in January 2010, and I was there in May and June, and then in July and August of that year. And I could really see the examples of the vast inequality in mobility. Immediately after the earthquake, the US military came in right away and took over the airport in Port-au-Prince, and they controlled it before they were even invited. And that right there lay bare the fact that air systems and access to air basically is something we are allowed to do because the military power lets civilian aircraft fly. In a disaster, civilian aircraft can immediately be grounded. And really, it's the military who controls airspace. So you see right away military control of airspace. And then you see that the foreigners were able to come into Haiti to help, but people in Haiti were not able to leave. And in fact, as some refugees started to leave in small boats in the months after the earthquake, they were intercepted by the US Coast Guard and they were returned to Haiti. So you see, in a disaster, you see a flow of responders, of humanitarian aid, people and equipment coming into the country, but very few people are able to actually leave the disaster zone, and especially the poorest. So there were about, I think it was 30,000 Haitians who were able to leave the country right after the earthquake, but they were generally US passport holders, or they already had a passport and a visa, and they could fly out maybe through Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Those were the few who were able to leave, while the vast majority were stuck in what were called IDP camps, or camps of internally displaced people. So I contrast the view from the airplane window as I'm flying into Haiti, and I have this power to have a passport, to have vaccinations, to be able to have the money to pay for a ticket, to be able to bring a smartphone, which allows me access not only to the internet, but to maps, to really good Google Earth maps of the entire geography of Haiti, that no local people had access to any of those forms of mobility or network capital. And to contrast with that, you could think of what kind of mobility did Haitians have access to. And they have their buses, which are these beautiful, colorful buses called tap-taps. And one of the classic images you see on the decorations of the tap-tap buses is running along the top of it is an airplane, a painted airplane. And people are sitting up on top of the bus with their luggage. Is as close as most of those people will ever get to air travel or to flight, because they're the people without passports, the people without visas. And so they end up sitting on top of a hot, dusty bus on a mock airplane, in contrast to the rescuers who were coming to help them. So we have this kind of militarization of airspace and this access of the foreigners with network capital, and you can contrast that with those who don't have access to those things. And it's also important to think about how does that relate to wider power relations in the Caribbean. So in a disaster, it's an extreme situation, but we can think about tourism also, and the ways in which tourism is a form of access by those with mobility capability to go to a place, to enjoy a place, to leave and go home when they need to, whereas the people who work in the tourist areas often do not have that kind of ability to move around in the same way. So I think for me, kind of thinking about failed mobility systems is a way to sort of unveil the power dynamics that are behind all of our mobility systems all of the time, but we mostly tend to ignore those inequalities.
Seite sowie den Außenbereich den Rechten.